We all know that feeling, right?
Yeah.
You're trying to really get to grips with something, dig a bit deeper,
Yeah.
you know, but there's just so much info out there. It can feel a bit like, well, too much.
Yeah, like drinking from a fire hose. It can be overwhelming.
Exactly. And that's where the deep dive comes in. We do the wading through all the stuff, all the reports and data, so you don't have to. We pull out the really important bits, the things that you actually need to know to make a difference.
You distill it down to the core insights.
Exactly. And today we're tackling something that's pretty crucial for any organization, any business really, that wants to improve, and that's KPIs, key performance indicators. We've got this really in-depth report here that's all about KPIs, packed with useful checklists and practical advice.
It's a really great resource.
It is. So our mission today is to help you understand how to implement KPIs effectively. Not just we're assuming you've got the basics, but how to actually use them to make things better in your organization.
We're moving past the theory,
Yeah.
getting into the real nitty-gritty of how to make these things work in practice.
Exactly. But before we get stuck in, a quick word from the folks that make this deep dive possible. This deep dive is brought to you by Stonefly. Stonefly has been a solution company serving its customers for over 2 decades. They offer the Stonefly DR365V, an immutable and air-gapped backup and DR appliance.
I can tell you from personal experience that their strength is in their detailed technical engineering.
Mm.
They've got this wealth of experience in building really robust solutions.
Awesome. And you can find out more about their offerings at stonefly.com. So let's get back to KPIs. The very first step, it's not even about numbers or picking specific metrics, is it?
No, it's not. The report we're looking at stresses that you absolutely have to agree on where you're going your business strategy before you even start thinking about what to measure.
Right. So it's like, you need to know if you're building a house or fixing a car before you go to the hardware store. You need the right tools for the job.
Yeah, exactly. And the report, it actually cautions against just grabbing some generic off-the-shelf KPI set and trying to make it fit. It's like, imagine someone just handing you a wrench without knowing what you're trying to do. You need KPIs that are tailored to your business, your specific goals, and your ambitions.
So it's not one size fits all.
Definitely not. Your KPIs have to reflect your unique journey, right?
Okay, so it's not just about having a vague sense of where you want to go. It's about how you're going to measure that progress.
Yeah, that's where the rubber meets the road. And this deep dive, that's what we're all about. We're going to get practical here. The report actually outlines this system. They call it a results-orientated KPI system. It's got all these steps that take you from that big picture strategy down to those concrete measures.
Don't worry, we'll get into the specifics of that system as we go. But first, can we just define what a KPI actually is? For our listener who might not be completely familiar with the term.
Sure. The report says a KPI is a thing that shows you how you are doing at a particular activity to achieve a particular level or outcome. It's basically a signal light on your business dashboard.
I like that analogy.
Yeah, it's a good one. And they also point out that, KPI, measure, and metric, they're all pretty much interchangeable. The key part just emphasizes how important it is to achieving your goals.
And it's not just about the financials, right? I know when I hear KPI, I tend to think, oh, profits, revenue, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's natural. But those are actually lagging indicators, right? They tell you what has already happened. You also need leading indicators, things that give you a peek into the future, a sense of where you're headed. Like, think about driving a car. Your financial reports are your rearview mirror, but your leading KPIs, those are your windshield.
So you need both to steer effectively.
Exactly. You need to see where you've been and where you're going.
Okay, so let's say you have your business strategy in place. How do you know if it's actually, good enough to guide your KPI selection?
Good question. The report actually has this really handy strategy fitness checklist. It asks these basic questions like, is the strategy actually written down? It sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised. If it's just in someone's head, it's hard to get everyone on the same page.
And it needs to be understandable to someone outside your specific department, right?
Absolutely. The report emphasizes that. No jargon, just plain language that anyone can grasp. And it also asks if it's still relevant. The world changes fast, so your strategy needs to keep up.
And too many strategic objectives can be a problem too, right?
Definitely. The checklist actually asks, are there fewer than 7 strategic objectives? Too few, and you might not be breaking things down enough. Too many, and you risk spreading yourself too thin. They suggest between 2 and 7 is a good sweet spot.
Focus is key.
Absolutely. You need to be clear about your top priorities.
The report actually mentions a workshop that went nowhere because there wasn't a clear strategy.
Yeah, that's a great example of what can go wrong. It was a nonprofit, and they were trying to figure out how to measure their performance, but they ended up arguing about what their goals even were.
Oof. So that's a recipe for disaster.
It is. It shows you that without a solid strategy, any KPI work is just going to be spinning your wheels.
Now, mission statements and strategic objectives, they're related but different, right?
Yes. A mission statement is more like your overarching purpose, the big why behind your organization. Strategic objectives are more specific, more actionable. They're those SMART goals you hear about: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound.
So the mission statement is the North Star, and the strategic objectives are the steps you take to get there.
That's a good way to put it. And once you've got those objectives, there's another checklist to make sure they're clear enough to measure.
Right, because you can't measure something if you don't know what it is.
Exactly. So this checklist, it's called Are Your Strategic Objectives Clear? And it stresses keeping things concise. No more than 2 sentences per objective. And it warns against those vague, fluffy words, like synergy or excellence. They sound impressive, but they're hard to actually define and measure.
Can you give us a couple of examples of what a clear strategic objective might look like?
Sure. The report has some good ones, like increase bank capital ratio to 11%, or reduce loss of life through road accidents by 50%. Even something very specific like become the biggest UK supplier of rubber ducks. You see how those are concrete and measurable.
Definitely. Okay, so we have a clear strategy, well-defined objectives. What's next in this KPI journey?
Now it's about getting people involved. Step 2 is all about engagement, and this is crucial. Organizations are complex, right? Lots of people, everyone's busy, and things can easily fall apart at this stage if you don't get it right.
So you can't just create KPIs in a vacuum.
No way. The report really emphasizes the need for a communication plan. You have to think about what information needs to be shared, who needs to know, and when.
And what are some of the key things you need to consider for that communication plan?
It's about the how, the when, and the who. So, are you going to use email, face-to-face meetings? What about the timing? Will it be a one-off or regular updates? And who's actually delivering the message? Do they have the right skills? And most importantly, who are you talking to? What do you want them to know, to think, or to do?
Right, because different people will need different information presented in different ways. The report also talks about different categories of stakeholders. Can you explain why that's important?
Yes. They break it down into 4 groups: data originators, data aggregators, data packagers, and internal customers. The originators are the ones actually collecting the raw data. Aggregators compile it, packagers analyze it and create reports, and the internal customers are the ones who use the insights to make decisions.
So it's about understanding the different roles people play in the data ecosystem.
Exactly, and tailoring your communication to each group's needs. You wouldn't communicate the same way to someone inputting numbers into a spreadsheet as you would to a senior executive making strategic decisions based on that data.
Makes sense. So how do you actually figure out who's who and how to engage them?
The report introduces this really useful tool called a RACI matrix. RACI stands for Responsible, Accountable, Consulted, Informed.
Okay, break that down for me.
Sure, it's basically a table. You list all the different roles across the top, and then your KPIs or reports or strategic objectives down the side. And for each item, you identify who's responsible for doing the work, who's accountable for making sure it gets done right, who needs to be consulted before a decision is made, and who just needs to be informed about what's going on.
It's a way to visually map out roles and responsibilities.
Exactly. It brings clarity and makes sure the right people are involved at the right times, and it really helps you group your stakeholders so you can communicate effectively.
And what about when you need to get all those stakeholders together, for workshops or discussions? Any tips there?
Yeah, the report stresses a few key points. First, be crystal clear about the purpose of the meeting. Why are you all there? Second, keep the group manageable. 10 to 12 people is usually a good size for productive discussion. And finally, be mindful of the existing hierarchy. You want to create a space where everyone feels comfortable sharing their thoughts, regardless of their seniority.
Okay, so we've engaged our stakeholders. Now it's time to start thinking about what we should actually be measuring. How do we go from those strategic objectives to a list of potential KPIs?
Right. That's step 3, and it's about using what the report calls KPI trees to come up with a long list of possible measures. And the report highlights this tension between what you'd ideally like to measure and what's actually practical to measure.
So you start with brainstorming, even if some ideas seem a bit out there at first.
Exactly. Cast a wide net before you start narrowing things down.
So what exactly is a KPI tree?
It's a visual way to show how your big strategic objectives connect to those more tactical things and then down to the specific everyday measures.
So it's like a map that shows you the path from your goal to the individual steps you need to take.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And the report actually has this example based on the objective, be healthy. It branches down into themes like eat well and sleep well, and then to actual measures like log daily calorie intake or aim for 7+ hours of sleep.
It helps you see the big picture and the details at the same time.
Exactly. And that's a huge benefit of using KPI trees. It helps everyone understand how those individual actions contribute to those bigger strategic goals.
The report also cautions against just going for the most obvious measure. Why is that?
They give this really interesting example from call centers, average handling time or AHT. It seems logical to want to reduce that, right? Shorter calls, lower costs. But if that's your only focus, you might end up with agents rushing through calls, which could lead to lower customer satisfaction and more repeat calls.
So you're optimizing for one thing, but potentially creating problems elsewhere.
Exactly. And that's why these KPI trees are so valuable. They encourage you to think more broadly about the impact of your measures.
So how do you actually go about building these KPI trees?
The report suggests a 2-session approach. First session is all about making sure everyone understands the strategy and objectives, getting buy-in from senior leadership, explaining how these KPI trees work, and then breaking into groups to develop draft trees for each objective.
And the emphasis at this point is on brainstorming, right?
Mhm.
Not worrying too much about whether something is actually measurable.
Exactly. You want to capture all the ideas first. Then, after the session, someone takes all those draft trees and merges them into one big, comprehensive tree.
That must be a pretty big tree if you've got lots of objectives.
It can be. And then you have a second session to review that merged tree with everyone, identify any gaps, spot any potential problems, and ultimately get everyone to agree on the final version.
The report also mentions that you can even use Excel to visualize these relationships. That's pretty handy if you don't have access to specialized software.
Yeah, that's a good option. And they actually list a bunch of other tools you can use too, ranging from basic diagramming software to more sophisticated mind mapping tools. So there's something for everyone.
Okay, so now we have this potentially massive list of measures from our KPI trees. How do we actually narrow that down to the ones we're actually going to track?
Right, that's step 4. And it's all about being realistic. You can't measure everything. So the report introduces this tool called the KPI shortlisting matrix. It's a 4-box grid, and you plot each measure based on 2 things: how important it is to the business and how available the data is.
Okay, so importance is pretty straightforward, but what about availability? What would make a measure highly available versus not available at all?
So a 10 out of 10 for availability would be something that's already being automatically tracked by your systems. It's accurate, it's easy to access and analyze. A 0 would be something that's basically impossible to measure, maybe because it would be too expensive or disruptive to collect the data, or maybe the technology doesn't even exist yet.
So even if something is super important, if you can't actually get the data, it's not going to make the cut.
Exactly. And the report actually talks about this challenge of trying to measure things that are inherently difficult to quantify. They give some fascinating examples, like using indirect methods to measure the thickness of paper or how engaged toddlers are with a TV show.
So the shortlisting process involves going through all those measures from your KPI trees, rating them on importance and availability, and then plotting them on this grid.
Exactly. And you can do this in a workshop setting using sticky notes. It's a really visual way to do it.
And what does the final picture on this grid tell you?
You'll typically see 3 groups emerge. In the top right, you've got your use measures. These are high importance, high availability, so you implement them right away. Then you have the aspire measures in the top left. These are important, but the data is hard to get, so you might need to develop new processes or systems. And then the discard measures are either not important enough or too difficult to measure, so they go on the back burner.
And documenting those discarded measures is important too, right? So you can explain your reasoning later on.
Absolutely. It prevents those measures from creeping back in and helps you keep your reporting focused. And then for those aspire measures, you can treat them as mini projects with a project manager, a plan, and a timeline.
Okay, so we've got our prioritized short list of KPIs. Now, how do we make sure everyone understands exactly what each one means and how it's calculated?
That's step 5, and it's all about being crystal clear in your definitions. The report calls this the common sense problem. Just because a KPI has a descriptive name doesn't mean everyone will interpret it the same way. They give an example of utilization in professional services firms. It can mean different things to different people.
So you need precise definitions to avoid confusion.
Exactly. And the report has this checklist called KPI definition. It asks all these important questions. What's the name of the KPI? Why are you measuring it? What's the exact formula? Where does the data come from? What resources are needed to produce it? Who will be using it? What's the target? And so on.
It's really comprehensive.
Yeah.
And where should all this information be kept?
The report emphasizes having a single central location where all these KPI definitions are stored and managed. That way, everyone's working from the same playbook and you avoid conflicting definitions.
So it's the single source of truth for all things KPI.
Exactly. And then the second part of this step is about setting up those meetings that actually make use of these KPIs. The report stresses that the whole point of performance review meetings is to make informed decisions based on good data. So you need to define the reporting inputs, what reports will be reviewed, what data needs to be presented.
And that's where the terms of reference come in. Right.
Exactly. The TOR is a one-page document that outlines everything about the meeting: the purpose, the scope, the inputs, the outputs, who's attending, their roles, the frequency, the duration, everything.
So it's like a rule book for the meeting.
Yeah, exactly. It sets clear expectations and helps keep things focused and productive.
Okay, so we have our KPIs defined, and we know how they'll be used in meetings. Now, how do we actually present all this information in a way that people can understand and use to make decisions?
Right. Step 6 is all about prototyping your dashboards and reports. And the report highlights a common challenge here. Often the people who will be using these reports don't actually know what they need until they see it.
So they might just ask for tweaks to existing reports that might not even be very good in the first place.
Exactly. So the key is to prototype. Build those early versions, get feedback, and iterate until you get it right.
So how many iterations do you typically go through?
The report says it's not uncommon to do 5 to 10 iterations before you land on a design that truly works for everyone.
So where do you even start with prototyping?
The report outlines a 4-stage process. Stage 1 is all about agreeing on good design principles. Before you even touch a chart, you need to have that conversation about what good design looks like.
So it's about avoiding those bad habits that might have crept into your existing reports.
Exactly. The report really emphasizes clarity and effectiveness over fancy visuals. It's about presenting the data in a way that people can actually understand and use.
Makes sense. What about stage 2?
Stage 2 is about observing how those existing reports are actually being used. You watch people in meetings, you ask them about their workflows, and you try to understand what's working and what's not.
So you're looking for that gap between what people say they do and what they actually do.
Exactly. Then stage 3 is where you actually start creating those design options. You can build static mock-ups, do live collaborative sessions, or use a hybrid approach.
And the optional stage 4 is about reviewing those existing reports more formally.
Yeah, if there's a lot of debate about the quality of your current reports, you can do a more structured review using a checklist. The report actually mentions a few good checklists and books on data visualization that can help.
So you're not just going on gut feeling, you're evaluating those reports against objective criteria.
Right. And the checklist would cover things like the use of color, the layout, the choice of fonts, the types of charts used, the clarity of labels, and so on. It's about making sure the information is presented in a way that's clear, concise, and easy to understand.
And once you've gone through this whole prototyping process and you have a design that everyone's happy with, how do you actually roll it out?
That's step 7, and it's all about getting buy-in from the organization. The report breaks it down into 5 stages: creating engagement, building a pace for measurement, removing any roadblocks, demonstrating the importance of the new system, and fostering good habits.
So it's as much about change management as it is about the technical stuff.
Absolutely. You have to get people on board with the new way of doing things.
So how do you create that initial engagement?
Involving people early is key. Getting them involved in those KPI tree sessions, explaining why these measures are important, and being transparent about the goals and benefits.
And building the case for measurement is about showing people the value.
Yeah, exactly. You have to demonstrate how this will help solve problems and improve things, and you need to address any concerns about increased workload.
Removing roadblocks sounds like making it as easy as possible for people to adopt the new system.
That's right. So you create clear user guides, provide training, have support readily available, and make it clear who to contact if they have problems.
And fostering good habits is about making sure those new processes stick.
Yes. It's about consistency, predictability, and reinforcement. You want to minimize variation, establish a regular reporting cadence, address any noncompliance quickly, fix problems promptly, and give positive feedback when people are doing things right.
The report also talks about the challenge of dealing with all that existing data within an organization. You know, legacy systems, data quality issues, and so on.
Yeah, that's a big one. They actually categorize those common problems, things like data being in different formats, contradictory information, duplicate data in different places, lack of trust in the data, and delays in collecting it all.
So how do you start tackling that mess?
They suggest creating a simple inventory of where all that data lives, and then asking some tough questions about how it's stored, how it's collected, and whether those methods are actually effective.
The report also mentions this concept of SMNB, right?
Yes, single-minute exchange of dye. It's a methodology originally for manufacturing, but they apply it to speeding up report production.
So it's about reducing that wasted time.
Exactly. And they give this checklist. Observe the current process. Figure out what can be done while the process is running versus what needs to be done when it's stopped. Streamline those steps and reduce the time for everything.
They also advise against jumping straight to IT solutions, right?
Yeah, they say you need to understand the underlying manual processes and data quality issues first. Go through that circle of tedium to really get to the root of the problem.
Makes sense. What about the different technology options for collecting data?
They list a whole range, from Excel and SharePoint to paper forms and dedicated software. And they have this checklist to help you choose the right one based on things like your budget, your IT infrastructure, your data volume, and your analysis needs.
And once you've got all this data coming in, you need tools to analyze it.
Yeah, and they recommend looking at things like the Gartner BI Magic Quadrant report to compare different tools. They stress that every tool has its strengths and weaknesses, so it's about finding the right fit.
How frequently you measure and report on those KPIs is also important, right?
Absolutely. They call it the KPI heartbeat, and they say you shouldn't just base it on your current reporting cycles if those don't actually make sense for your business.
So it's about finding the right rhythm for your data.
Exactly. And if you're rolling out new systems or processes, they also recommend running a pilot first, a proof of concept.
Test it out before you go all in.
Yeah, that's right. And they have a checklist for that too, covering things like choosing the right users, selecting diverse operational areas, doing a risk assessment, getting buy-in from management, and setting clear success criteria.
And what about managing risk during this whole rollout process?
They talk about using FMEA, failure mode, and effects analysis. It's a structured way to identify potential problems, assess their impact, and prioritize your mitigation efforts.
So you're proactively looking for those weak spots.
Exactly. And they also have a pre-flight checklist for before you launch those new reports and dashboards. Get sign-off from your data sources, publish those KPI definitions, do some final testing with a friendly audience, and be ready to gather feedback.
Feedback is crucial.
It is. And when it comes to formalizing those reporting processes, you often need SLAs, service level agreements.
What are some of the pitfalls to avoid there?
The report warns against SLAs that are too complicated, not understood by the users, set at unrealistic levels, or just not based on any evidence. They say keep it simple, get buy-in from the process owners, document your reasoning, and ideally have some data to back up those targets.
And what about those inevitable problems that pop up after you launch? How do you deal with those?
They have a checklist for reducing production effort. Map out the process, get rid of any unnecessary steps, combine things where possible, automate manual tasks, simplify everything, and make sure the right people are doing the right jobs.
They also give some advice on handling those major crises that can derail your reporting.
Yeah. They say communicate clearly, explain why you're pausing reporting, state your intention to restart it, agree on a timeline, and have a clear process for addressing any breaches of those SLAs. And they stress the importance of making those reports readable. No one's going to use a report that's a chore to decipher.
It all comes back to clarity and usability.
Absolutely. And they actually recommend observing how people use those reports in meetings. Are they looking at the right things? Are they understanding the data? Are they making the right decisions?
So it's not just about creating the reports, it's about making sure they're actually being used effectively.
Exactly. And all of this feeds into continuous improvement, right?
KPIs aren't just about measuring things, they're about making things better.
That's it. They talk about the PDCA, cycle plan, Do, check, act. You plan your strategy, you collect the data, you analyze it, and then you take action based on what you've learned.
And that cycle just keeps going.
Exactly. Improvement is never finished.
Once those new KPIs and reporting processes are running smoothly, how do you hand them over to the business teams?
That's the final stage of the rollout, and they stress making that handover comprehensive. You provide detailed documentation, process maps, user guides, SLAs, templates, everything those teams need to keep things running.
So you don't just launch it and walk away.
No way. You want to make sure those teams are set up for success. And the report also talks about the importance of sustaining those new KPIs over time.
Because things can easily fall apart if you're not careful.
Exactly. They list some common reasons for derailment, things like losing your senior sponsor, facing resistance from skeptics, key people leaving, losing trust in the data, and just general neglect.
So how do you avoid those pitfalls?
They suggest things like regularly reviewing your KPIs, revisiting old measures, spreading ownership, and identifying any single points of failure. Basically, you need to stay vigilant and keep those KPIs relevant and useful.
Wow, this has been a real deep dive into KPIs, a lot to think about.
It has. But the key takeaway is that having a structured, practical approach is essential for success.
And as a final thought for our listeners, remember that those KPIs are only as good as the actions they inspire.
If they don't lead to change, they're just numbers on a page.
So if you want to delve deeper into any of these topics, be sure to check out the report and the resources we've mentioned.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of KPIs.
This deep dive was sponsored by Stonefly. Visit stonefly.com to learn more about their immutable and air-gapped backup and DR appliance, the Stonefly DR365V, and how their decades of experience as a solution company can benefit your organization.